In 2015, in a referendum, Britain votes to leave the European Union. Under the Lisbon Treaty, a 2-year transition process begins. Our MEPs leave the Parliament and Britain's EU Commissioner stands down. By the summer of 2017, the transition is complete. Britain is out of the single market, the common agricultural policy, the common fisheries policy, the European Court of Justice. Blue flags disappear from Britain's beaches. But what then?
It's December the 12th, 2020. Here's the news. The Office for Budget Responsibility today confirmed that for the third year in a row, Britain is growing faster than at any time since the Blair era. GDP growth stood at 4%, though the Chancellor said that inflation remained unacceptably high.
Predicting what Britain's future might look like if we left the EU is difficult because there's no authoritative research. But if we did leave and growth picked up, what might have gone right to make that happen?
Over a period of time, we would benefit because we could have freer trade with the rest of the world, lower food prices. We could wind down some of the renewables legislation, be lower electricity prices, fewer directives and regulations, more small businesses would come back. We wouldn't have all of these problems of people coming from Europe and wanting our welfare benefits and to use the NHS. So in all these ways, Britain would benefit.
Britain is a net importer from the European Union, running a trade deficit with the EU last year. That should make it possible to do a trade deal. One option would be to do what Norway did and remain part of the European Economic Area. But in this more radical scenario, the UK secures a favourable bilateral trade deal modelled on Switzerland. And it quickly signs new bilateral deals with key markets set to experience high growth: Brazil, China, India and Russia. Some analysts claim European regulations cost business £19 billion a year. In this scenario, these are scrapped. The UK would choose which social legislation it wanted to keep, for example, the Working Time Directive or the Agency Workers Directive, which have been controversial here. In this scenario, agricultural subsidies, £3.8 billion, are phased out, and Britain's £8 billion net transfer to the EU ends. And as free movement of labour in and out of the EU is cancelled, there'd likely be a workforce effect. It might be positive.
Unemployment has fallen to a 10-year low. The claimant count was just 700,000 last month, as manufacturing employment is rising and as European migrant workers leave. The number of EU citizens living in the UK, which peaked at 2 million in 2012, has halved. Most coffee bars and fast food stores are now 90% staffed by UK nationals.
Helen, what do you think Britain would be like? Do you be
I think it would be a proud independent nation outside the EU. I mean, we'll be able to play a proper role on the world scene. I mean, the EU is only, 27 countries, and there are 180 countries in the world.
The euro, the Chinese regard as extremely dangerous because they simply don't understand or can predict where it's going to go. The sterling is not as great a currency, perhaps, but there is much more certainty. And already the British government is doing quite a lot in terms of trying to help the renminbi to become convertible, more than anybody else. Yeah. Yes. And so actually, Britain is doing quite well. And so the question whether it's in and out, for me, is irrelevant.
It doesn't. I think what needs to happen now is that we need to have a new relationship with the EU.
The euro crisis deepens. Ties with old allies are strained. Deep divisions. Britain out on its own.
What is on offer isn't in Britain's interests.
I have to ask you, having listened to your words this morning, just what planet are you on? This pretense that everything's going incredibly well. The EU is mired in deep structural crisis. Greece and Portugal and Ireland cannot survive inside the euro. The Danes have torn up the Schengen Agreement, and good for them, because the total free movement of peoples is a completely irresponsible thing to have done. And public opinion is saying, whilst they want a European cooperation, yes, of course I agree with that, what they don't want is this Europe run by unelected bureaucrats like Mr Barroso. You say the EU is fantastic in a recent comment. You're supporting the destruction of national democracy. But it's with reference to Greece that I'm most concerned about you, because when faced with their recent enslavement, you said, "We lived for many years as a non-sovereign country under Soviet occupation. For us, European integration is not a threat to sovereignty because we experienced not long ago a serious threat to our sovereignty." So what are you saying? That this isn't quite as bad as the USSR? Is that really good enough for your people? And today you describe Greece's problems as trivial. I'm sorry, there are hundreds of thousands of people out there on the streets of Greece fighting to get their democracy back. And it beggars belief that you and our President, Mr Buzek, can talk about the solidarity movement, can talk about Poland getting its democracy back 20 years ago, and yet here you are, surrendering the democracy and sovereignty of Poland to a failed European Union. Yes, sir, we all want a shared European cooperation for the future, but this most definitely is not the model.
Thank you, Mr. Co-President. To answer with the blue card question. Mr. Goebbels, blue card question.
Monsieur Farage me rappelle.
Thank you, President. Mr. Farage is a little bit like a cockerel. You know, he's sitting on a heap of unmentionables and going cockle-doodle-doo. But apart from the criticism, what about suggestions do you have for the future of this continent then, Mr. Farage?
Post-1945, there were some very sensible ideas put together, namely the Council of Europe. Let's have a Europe where we sit down together, where we have a free trade agreement, where we agree minimum standards on work, on the environment. We can do all of these things without a European Commission, without a European Parliament, and without a European Court of Justice. We've done it in security terms with NATO. Yes, it'll mean you'll lose your job, Mr Barroso, but apart from that, why can't we do things as mature democracies? Yes, I want you sacked, Mr Schulz, as well. I want you all fired. We can do those things, and that is a positive way forward. By taking away from people their ability to govern themselves and transferring that power to the European Commission, we're headed for a Europe of rebellion and violence. Let's take the democratic route.
Thank you, colleagues.
We live in historic times as huge questions surface about our future with Europe. At home, living standards are falling, destroying lives and hope.
I've got a family to support, an house to keep, a roof to keep over my head.
But is there a new route back to prosperity? New markets to be exploited, new jobs to be created?
While they're messing around in Europe, we have to continue. I really wish they'd get it sorted though, because we're going to be limited. I can only keep pushing the boundaries a little bit at a time.
Just 4 days ago, European leaders met. Desperate to save the euro, 26 countries agreed to try to strengthen their ties. David Cameron refused to sign Britain up, saying it would stop our ability to defend our financial services industry.
We are still members of the European Union. We have access to the single market. But the deal that was offered to David Cameron in the early hours of Friday morning was one that was not in our national interest, didn't protect our interests, and therefore the Prime Minister was absolutely right to say that he wouldn't sign up to it.
He may be right. People may even agree with you. But surely, even so, there is a cost to damaging that relationship.
Well, the fact is that we do trade a lot with the European Union, but that is individual businesses and customers trading with individual businesses and customers elsewhere. We want access to European markets, and it's right that European businesses have access to our markets, and that will continue.
The markets remain worried. Indeed, many in the financial world think that at best Europe is tying itself into years of austerity. At worst, the euro could collapse.
It cannot sustain itself. It's not competitive, it can't pay its debt off, and so whether it's the periphery going first or the core knocking the periphery out, it's inevitable that Europe will collapse. The politicians are just buying time. There's nothing that can be done unless you create proper growth through stimulation that can move yourself out of this type of crisis.
So let's be clear, you think the euro, and indeed the EU as an institution, will end?
Absolutely. It's inevitable.
This European Union is the new communism. It is power without limits. It is creating a tide of human misery, and the sooner it is swept away, the better. And what of this place? What of the Parliament? This Parliament has the ability to hold the Commission to account. I have put down a motion of censure debate on the table. I wonder whether any of you have the courage to recognise it and to support it. I very much doubt that, and I'm minded that there's a new Mrs Thatcher in Europe, and he's called Fritz Bolkestein, and he has said of this Parliament, remember he's a former commissioner, it is not representative anymore. For the Dutch or European citizen, the European Parliament is living out a federal fantasy which is no longer sustainable. How right he is.
There is something very wrong with our economy, that it's very badly balanced, that it's in the wrong place, that we need to do something dramatic to move it into a different place.
That place is not familiar. Getting there won't be easy. We'll have to make some big decisions if we're to secure our children's future prosperity.